First is Nebraska Skies 5, David Eakins. Or is it Eakins?
Eakins.
Yeah. And what I really, design-wise, what I was struck with is this is utilizing the rule of thirds, which is a design principle. It's a sort of classic compositional guideline that you can use. And he's dividing, you have 1, 2, 3, right? Which is creating a really nice composition that's very pleasing to the eye, gives really good balance. And you can also do an additional dividing like this, so you get a grid of 6. And that's a very classical composition used by many artists throughout history. But beyond that was also the brush strokes. The way he's painted this picture really gives you like the sense of how that wind is moving across that vast plain. And these sort of implied lines of these darker areas sort of drawing our eye across. So I just thought it was beautifully handled with material and composition, very nice. And I like the choice of scale here, where it's a relatively small painting, and yet it's depicting a very vast space. This is Medici Fountain by Cudlin. And so I had to look up Medici Fountain because I wasn't that familiar with it. But it's a romantic Italian Renaissance design built in 1963. It sort of blends classical symmetry, rich colors, lush and mythological motifs, which creates this sort of deeply passionate, timeless aesthetic. It's highly ornate, it's deeply crafted for the sake of beauty, right? That was kind of what this style was at the time. In contrast, we have this overlaid image on the bottom of a public pool, which is purely designed out of function and utility. So with sort of little regard for aesthetics. So we have this very contrasting images, old versus new, sort of beauty versus function, highly ornate versus very sort of modern and streamlined bland, right? Beautiful, rich granite and marble against concrete. A lot of duality happening in this photograph. So I think that was just a really interesting choice. This artist could have plainly took a beautiful photograph of the Medici Fountain, and we all would have been like, wow, that's so beautiful. But the choice to have that conversation happening, I think is really interesting conceptually.
Yeah.
Waterlilies by Danielle Doctor. And again, this is a great example of that thirds rule for composition to create a really pleasing, something for us to look at. And here, what we're seeing is an interesting conversation about color palette. All of the colors on the bottom half are also depicted on the top half here in these little tiny squares. And it's also a contrast of sort of digital or the virtual world, right? How we see our phone in pixelations up here depicted in the little squares. And then the world we see, the natural world we see physically embodied in front of us. And again, choosing to have this sort of a very intimate moment where it's very small, so we have to get up close to it, but then sort of depicting a sort of vastness of a lake, right, or a pond that we see laid out in front of us, and that reflection. And so maybe this artist, maybe taking leaps here, but sort of reflecting our current situation that we live in back on us, how we are so engrossed in our screen every day now on our phone. Best mom ever. I really, really, really enjoyed this piece a lot. I spent a lot of time looking at this piece. Again, we see a really well laid out composition here. The reference again to art history with cubism, how the distortion of body parts is sort of warping our reality. We're kind of like, what's going on here? But the way things are foreshortened and enlarged, stretching reality. But also there's this intense stare at us from all three figures. Right. You're like, oh, and you feel like, oh, I've caught this intimate moment that I'm not supposed to see. And so there's this sort of emotional confrontation here. And I just think it tells a really compelling story, and I have a 3.5-year-old, so that childhood experience is still fresh with me. It can be absolutely exhausting. I feel like that is kind of what we're getting from this space. And this child is like, come on, what's going on? So very emotionally charged, very well painted, but in a way that's very interesting, the way that they've manipulated, to not be realistic, right? Taking liberties in the way the figure has been depicted here. Then we have Shell Fragment number 3 by Kelly Mattox. This one down here. And why I really like this one, the scale between the two shells gives us this interesting relationship of big versus small, maybe adult versus child. And the vibrant yellow background makes the shells sort of in their complementary hue appear to be moving towards us. And again, sort of the way in which paint is manipulated gives it a little bit of vibrancy, makes it a little more alive versus it being a little more still with maybe a more smooth application of paint. But I thought really nice balanced composition. I teach a 3D design course, and I often talk to my students about how balance doesn't always have to be equal, right? We can have balance in asymmetry, and I think this is what this offers here, which I think is quite interesting. Bristly Old Chap by Michael Dunaway. Humor in this, the handling of the clay is really nice. It's created a very expressive bust, but also feels skin-like with the way that it's smoothed out. You can really get a sense of this sort of rough old man, right, as the Bristly Old Chap implies. Sort of the way in which, the wrinkles on the face, the use of the mixed media to represent his mustache, the glasses, the very kind of thick eyebrows, and also maybe a sense of tiredness, the way in which, it's not a full bust, it's just sort of the head kind of lying back. Very expressive, but also very humorous and tongue-in-cheek. So I really enjoyed that piece a lot. Yeah. I will say too, the choice of the raw clay I think is really nice here, where there's often a tendency in ceramics and my students struggle with this a lot, is like, you make something in ceramics and you're like, oh, well, I have to glaze it. No, you don't actually, especially when it's sculptural. Glaze is a great surface to make things food safe, but a lot of times when it comes to sculpture, it actually maybe works against you. And then this is a great example of that, where if this was glazed, it would not have that same skin-like appearance to it.